go ahead and start. It is a real delight to welcome Dr. Cal Bond from just right down the road, a little bit west of us from the, to get out all my notes here now, sorry about that, from Greensboro College, where he teaches. He's currently the professor of biology in the Department of Natural, sorry?
A professor of biology, not the.
The professor, okay, a professor of biology. He's a graduate from Amherst College and received his PhD locally from UNC Chapel Hill. And Cal was recommended to us on the basis of a talk he gave to the Audubon Society about birds and birds evolution and bird fossils. And it was really fascinating. And he's a great storyteller. So we thought he'd be a great addition to our lineup this year. And so I'm really pleased to welcome our neighbor from Greensboro and from Mebane, Dr. Cal Bond. And the title of his talk today, you know what? I'm not going to try and pronounce the bird names because I know I'll get it wrong. I'm just going to turn it over to you and ask you to share with us your theories and thoughts about this topic.
Well, thank you. I guess, do I pin or just, shall I pin or shall I just go straight to the to my PowerPoint? I can do that. Well, let me share.
Yeah, go ahead and start sharing.
Yeah, I'll start sharing. Let's see. Hopefully that's going to do it. Oh, thank you. All right, let's here. Come on. Oh, wait a minute. There we go. How's that look? Okay.
You're good.
We're good. Let me. Yeah. All right. Well, I would like to thank Ramona Kraler. I hope I pronounced her last name correctly, for inviting me to talk before your group. And I'm grateful to Mike Bruff for facilitating this Zoom meeting. Today, I would like to present a review of an old but still provocative topic in biology: the origin of birds and of bird flight. This topic continues to receive a lot of attention due to an ever-increasing wealth of new scientific findings, which often involve some very odd fossils. I will try and concentrate on two of these fossils. I do not claim any authority or credit on the points that I will be discussing here, but I have been dealing with this and related topics for about 20 years of teaching biology courses, including regular bouts with ornithology and with vertebrate natural history. The textbooks for these courses have given me most of the figures. Oh, come on, there it goes. Most of the figures that you will see today, with some important supplements from the primary literature, often assisted by the New York Times and others. Thus, today I hope to give you a version of a lecture that I've given to my students on how one can interpret bird origins from the fossil record. And this is, some people call it the original bird, and it may well be. This is the Berlin specimen of Archaeopteryx, discovered in 1861. Probably one of the most important artifacts in biology. It was discovered soon after Darwin first published Origin of Species, and it generated lots of attention because it is clearly a transitional fossil showing a mix of reptile and avian traits. And you note the time, it's 150 million years old. And that date's going to be important because we are talking about what we consider to be the oldest bird. This fossil and others like it, there are only about 12 known fossils of Archaeopteryx. This fossil has generated a number of important issues, some of which I'm going to cover more thoroughly than others. Where does this animal belong among the Archosaur lineages? We'll talk about what an Archosaur is. Was it a feathered theropod dinosaur? How aerial was it? Was it gliding, flapping, or both? Where did it live? Did it live in the trees? Or was it a running predator on the ground? That is a very old controversy. And it had feathers, and the feathers were already clearly functioning for flight. We'll talk about why that is, or why we think that. And this leads to the fact that where did these feathers come from? How did they evolve? And the take-home message, I guess, is this the oldest bird known from the fossil record. So we're going to hit most of these points, some harder than others, to lead up to answering the last question. This is what an Archosaur is. This is about as, back up, sorry. This is about as basic as it gets when you're an Archosaur. This is probably, I think, the oldest Archosaur fossil, or one of the oldest ones. Archosaurs, basically, they are the ruling reptiles, but they weren't ruling until after the Permian extinction, about 250 million years ago. They took over from mammal-like reptiles and some other groups that got wiped out by the Permian event. And they diversified into some amazing lineages. You see some interesting features for Archosaurs that also will find their ways to their various lineages. The skull is very distinctive in terms of openings, but for our purposes, I think some of the most interesting things are the fact about the limbs and the girdles. The legs are almost always longer than the arms in these lineages, which lends itself to walking on two legs. Anyway, this is the basic Archosaur. They used to be called thecodonts, but there are multiple lineages, and it's better to use the word Archosaur or basal Archosaur for these lineages. But these lineages diversified into a lot of things other than dinosaurs. You see two of the lineages already that include the dinosaurs and the birds. But I always tell my students the closest living relative of the birds today are not the dinosaurs, but are the crocodilians. And even more interestingly, the first flying vertebrates were not the birds, they were the pterosaurs, which were also an older lineage, 200 million years ago, I think. And then we have the dinosaur lineages you see there. And this is a classic phylogenetic tree showing clades or lineages and how they're, as you move up the tree, you have more derived, more modern lineages, and it shows where birds came from. And we're going to take this majority opinion through the rest of this talk. Theropods are the lineage that birds are found within. And they are the carnivorous bipedal dinosaurs. Anyway, whoops, oh, come on. Sometimes this works, there it goes. This shows how things have changed, but how they haven't changed either over 240 million years ago, Archosaur skull has some features that we see in Archaeopteryx, and these features are still present in the modern bird. Possibly the two things that happen between the Archosaur and the bird is lots of fusion of bones, some reduction in the openings, and of course the loss of the teeth. But Archaeopteryx is not that different from an Archosaur. And that's why we often hear from people that birds are clearly in the Archosaur lineages, but now the majority hypothesis is that birds are dinosaurs. This is the majority hypothesis. It has been a point of discussion since Thomas Huxley and back in the 1880s or earlier even. And it really became very popular in the 60s when more bird-like theropod dinosaurs were discovered and analyzed. And this is just one of them. This was found, it coexisted with Archaeopteryx in the fossil area and the fossil site, which is modern Bavaria. It looks really similar to Archaeopteryx, but it had no feathers. So, oh, come on, there we go. There are a whole host of skeletal similarities, we call them homologies, that link birds to the theropods. We're going to go through these, but I believe Bambiraptor is actually younger than Archaeopteryx in the fossil record, but it is clearly a predatory dinosaur, and it is one of those dinosaurs with the big toenails used as a defense and probably for prey. We're going to look at some of these homologies and see why people think birds are dinosaurs and why they're theropod dinosaurs. Here are the feet. Archosaurs all start with 4 to 5 feet. The small toe tends to get reduced, and digits tend to get lost. And it's interesting that the feet of Deinonychus, which was a predatory theropod, has a dew claw, just like the hind claw of Archaeopteryx. The hind claw is going to be analogous to our big toe. Not homologous, I should say. It is the big toe. That is digit 1. I believe these are all right feet because the big toe would be medial. Anyway, so that's similarities in the feet. Similarities the pubis. This gets weird because birds are in the Saurischia, the lizard hip lineages, but of course they have they are birds. And oddly enough, the bird hips are a completely separate lineage, but you see how the lineages become bird-like in their pubes, particularly with that major renovation with Deinonychus and Archaeopteryx. People call these are the bird-like dinosaurs. The pubis is facing backwards. And this is another demonstration of skeletal homology showing dinosaurs and birds could well be related. And then there's the clavicles. This is the birds, modern birds are defined by a couple of skeletal features that are found nowhere else now. One of them is the keeled sternum, and the other is the fused clavicle that we call the furcula. This is also the wishbone. It is a strut for the flight muscles. And fused clavicles are also found in theropods, even Tyrannosaurus. A very strong piece of evidence linking birds to dinosaurs. And then there are the hands. And this is another sequence showing the loss of digits and the fusion of digits and hand bones working towards the bird hand, the bird wing. And gives an interest, there's an interesting study here showing the dromaeosaur, the theropod that has big toenails. It also has predatory claws for grasping its prey. Archaeopteryx claws are shaped a little differently. We're going to get back to these claws later. And you notice they have some carpal bones that are similar. When you get to modern birds, and actually a lot of fossil birds, you get to have a lot of fusion. There's going to be a lot of fusion of the bird hand into the wing. But we're going to see this illustration again when we talk about where Archaeopteryx, where birds were living. Anyway, despite all these impressive phylogenetic trees, there are still several arguments, pretty cogent arguments, against these apparent similarities, these apparent homologies that link dinosaurs to birds. For example, most of these attributes, it has been argued, could occur due to convergent evolution of theropods as bipedal creatures, not just as bird relatives. In other words, all these similarities were there because theropods are bipedal predators, not because they're related to birds. That argument has a lot of staying power, and it irritates a lot of people. And they are not favored by the establishment anymore and by the textbooks. And they are beyond the scope of this talk at this time. But it is still very safe to say that Archaeopteryx, which is 150 million years ago old, is a transitional fossil, clearly showing a mix of avian and archosaur, if not dinosaur, skeletal traits. The other thing that this fossil shows is those feathers. They are flight feathers. They are asymmetric. And that is one of the most important findings that this fossil generated. And this is, we don't see these things very often because feathers are non-calcified. And you got to have a special fossil bed called a lagerstraton or straton that fossilizes soft materials or non-calcified materials like feathers. And fortunately, we can see the feathers in here. The feathers are asymmetric. That is, their leading edge is thinner, the vein is thinner on the leading edge than the trailing edge. That lends itself to a flight surface. We see this, evidence when we look at the corncrake, which is basically a rail, a flying marsh bird, and the weka is a New Zealand flightless marsh bird, same order, and it doesn't have asymmetric flight feathers, asymmetric body feathers. Ostrich plumes are all asymmetric. The feathers for the flightless birds are used for display and insulation. But Archaeopteryx had asymmetric feathers, and it gives very strong support that Archaeopteryx had an aerial lifestyle. And I'm going to argue that an aerial lifestyle is part of the way that we're going to define the oldest bird. Now, the last 30 years, China has opened up and has explored a number of fossil beds that are incredible in their diversity and preservations, different ages. And most of these fossils that you hear about, the feathered dinosaurs, have come from China. There are some others. And they are clearly dinosaurs, and they clearly have feathers, but they're all younger. The ones that we have known up till the last 10 years, they are all younger than Archaeopteryx. Therefore, they are not the oldest bird. They can argue for an evolutionary connection between birds and theropods, but we can't say that these are the original bird. We could say perhaps a bird ancestor, but they are not the original bird. Among these feathered dinosaurs is something that people still can't quite figure out. And it also has asymmetric feathers, but it has it on all four limbs. We still are not sure how this thing gets around, but models have been generated. This is Microraptor. It's younger than Archaeopteryx, but it's still fairly old. It's a dromaeosaur. It's related to the other raptors. It's a basal raptor. It's ancestral to the raptors with the big toenails, but it didn't have toenails or big toenails. It had 4 feathered limbs that were all clearly generating flight surfaces. Now, whether this thing flapped or glided is not certain, but it probably glided. You could probably generate a biplane, one of those double wing planes that you see from World War I. And the more we look at this thing, the more interesting it looks, because now people have been able to look at its plumage and its colors. Fossilization of melanosomes, of pigment granules, is such that we now can tell what color these feathers were by the morphology of the melanosomes in the feathers. And this thing had feathers that were glossy, iridescent black, like a grackle. By the way, this thing is, that scale bar is 5 centimeters. So this was basically about the size of a grackle. We're still not sure how it got around, but we're pretty sure it was in the trees. This thing would not do well on the ground. And I still wouldn't call it a bird. And still, nevertheless, it is also younger than Archaeopteryx. It's an aerial dinosaur, but I would not call it a bird. And it's definitely not the oldest bird. Whoops. Oh, come on. There we go. And then things got interesting. All these dinosaurs we've been looking at were younger than Archaeopteryx. But in 2008, 2009, a paper was published, I believe in Nature, it might have been Science, of a feathered dinosaur that was older than Archaeopteryx. And this is the other fossil we're going to be talking about. This is Antionus Huxley Eye. And this is the type specimen. It was discovered around 2008, 2009. It also had 4 feathered limbs. The limbs had, all four limbs had long feathers on it. Very well developed feathers. And this is some of the literature that, some of the press it was getting. It was, people were saying this may be the first bird. It's definitely older than the first bird. Feathers on all four limbs, and we'd see bizarre about, we knew about Microraptor. But then there's a very important statement that people kind of ignored. The feathers are smaller, they are symmetrical, and they are different from typical flight feathers, unlike what we saw in the Microraptor or from Archaeopteryx, making it unclear whether the animal can fly. I'm sorry, this thing probably didn't fly. But let's get in, let's go. This is a further reconstruction of Anchiornis 155 million years ago. It had symmetric feathers. It had long feathers on the legs and the arm. Question is, could this fly? Is this the oldest bird? And also, where did it live? You notice it's depicted on the ground. The most remarkable part about this picture is the plumage. This was done by Richard Prum and his colleagues with the help of the Chinese discoverers. And it is clear that the feathers had some sort of display function. The fact that they are symmetric makes it also clear that they were not for flight. They were probably for display and perhaps for insulation. We do not know if this was a dimorphic animal. I don't think we found enough fossils that show this. The leg feathers, this gets even weirder. This shows you a cladogram, a family tree of leg feathers in feathered dinosaurs, three of which, it might have been four, three of which I think could fly or at least glide. And Anchiornis had the longest. The others, they were shorter and then they disappeared, or they just became contour feathers instead of long feathers for display and perhaps helping in the flight. So long leg feathers is not unique to Anchiornis. I mean, we also have Microraptor, and this shows you the time context of Anchiornis, Microraptor, Archaeopteryx, and another four-winged dinosaur, which looks a little bit like, I think it was a little bit like Anchiornis, but actually not. The feathers were not as long. Anyway, Anchiornis is an old record. In the older strata, it was perhaps one of the first dinosaurs to have four long feathered limbs. Microraptor is quite younger than both Anchiornis and Archaeopteryx. And it is basal to the other predatory raptors that are on the same family tree. The implication at this table is that avian evolution went through a four-wing stage. And it gets, let's see if I can show you that. I might go back. Yeah, I'll continue. So looking at this and looking at the evolution and looking at the patterns and the strong coloration, you start thinking that these feathers were not for flight. They did not evolve for flight at first. The two functions that occur that are are the obvious alternatives, are installation and display and recognition. And we also have the claws. And the claws, you notice, they don't show the claws very, very clearly here, but further study, and the claws, fairly substantial, sorry. The claws are very similar to Archaeopteryx, and there have been a number of arguments that Archaeopteryx's claws suggest an arboreal habit. These claws were designed to grapple with trees and surfaces above the ground. Very different from the dromaeosaur, which was claws were basically for gripping prey. Archaeopteryx claws, the argument is, were for gripping tree trunks. There are lots of birds that are arboreal that have claws on their legs, of course, on their feet, that do this. So with this piece of information and some further studies, we have an updated depiction of Anchiornis, which blew me away when I saw this about 3 years ago. The claws and the feathers, I mean, look at this. It looks like it could go okay on the land, but I tell you, those long leg feathers just don't work running on the ground. But they wouldn't be an issue in the trees. And this thing looks almost more like a monkey or a lemur. In fact, there's a monkey that has flowing fur, very different diet. We don't know what Antionis ate, but I suspect it was predatory, possibly like a kinkajou or a lemur. And it probably could not fly because the feathers were not symmetric. But with the arboreal habit, you could definitely see this parachute possibility. The other thing is that the gray fuzz, it's not just fuzz, it's bifurcated contour feathers. That I think is unique with any feather bearing. I could be wrong, but these feathers were not for display primarily. These feathers looked like they were for insulation. So this animal showing the feathers are for insulation, display and recognition, not yet for flight, we think. The colobus possibly could use its long hair to help parachute, but this one definitely could use the feathers for display and for perhaps gliding or parachutes, breaking a fall. So looking at the sequence for the feathers has been generated. We see this sequence. This is not my idea, but it's just sort of my interpretation. We have this proposed evolutionary sequence. We have dino fuzz, kind of like the bifurcated stuff here. Dino fuzz for insulation arose first. Feathers are a great place to deposit pigments, so display can occur, and species recognition, pigment patterns could occur on feathers, and the feathers could get longer to increase display potential. The longer the feathers, the easier it would be to be in the trees than rather on the ground. So you go in the trees and you could become a dino bird mosaic in which you have the installation and the display and perhaps gliding. And You don't become a bird until you get active flight, and that's installation, display, gliding, and active flight is implied by the asymmetric feathers. Here's one tour through the sequence. The weird thing is the most primitive feathering is on one of the younger dinosaurs, but that's fairly typical with the feathered dinosaur record. This is Sinusoraptorics, 127 million years old. It was a predator, and they found fossils that clearly showed a pigment pattern of counter shading, brown above, white below, similar to what you would see in gazelles and other prairie inhabitants that would be running. But this guy would probably running after smaller lizards and smaller prey. And it was fuzz. It was a feather, it was a insulation material, but also was pigmented for species recognition and for camouflage, counter shading of sorts. Then of course we have the displays, patterns that we see on Anchiornis. And this suggests this modification of the sequence. The dinofuzz came first, and dinofuzz may be a very old innovation. Then the insulation continued, but because feathers are a good place to deposit pigment, you could have display feathers could get longer for sexual selection, via sexual selection. Then Anchiornis could be thought of as a dino bird mosaic, with being in the trees. I would argue that bird flight probably originated in the trees, not on the ground. And the display feathers could have helped this animal parachute from one tree to another. But you do not get active flight, the capability of active flight, until you get asymmetric feathers. And that's where we see Archaeopteryx. So I would say the appearance of asymmetric feathers and these other points make this final point. I still think Archaeopteryx, 150 million years old, should still be considered the oldest known bird in fossil record, mainly because of its dating, of its transitional morphology with the sharing of reptile and avian traits, and of the asymmetric feathers that clearly support active aerial flight. And I just want to say one thing that has been found or been argued about in literature. There is evidence that Archaeopteryx may also have had long feathers on the legs, but they were removed in the preparation back in the 1800s because they thought they weren't feathers. They didn't expect to have feathers on the legs, but that is out there. So Archaeopteryx may be a four-winged reptile too, but it's definitely got asymmetric wings for flight. And that's why I think it should still be considered the oldest known bird. And many thanks for your kind invitation and attention. And I welcome any questions. And do I need to go and chat, or I just?
So if anybody has any questions, they could unmute themselves and ask, or feel free to put it in the chat and we'll catch it there.
Oh, thank you, Mike.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I would like to know, is there any mechanism proposed by which the hind limbs could be used to assist in flight?
Yeah, I really think the biplane is about the best model that I've seen, and that it looks kind of dubious, but it's, who knows? They're not that powerful. The legs don't look that powerful. So I'm thinking display, but I'm thinking maybe gliding more than anything else for my.
So perhaps some flight control by being able to manipulate your legs.
That is definitely. I'm not fully cognizant of all the model of the model papers, but I'm pretty sure they basically had the wings up and the legs further down, like a biplane you would see, a crop duster, the old World War I biplanes. But your guess is as good as mine. If you have a better idea, I'm sure there's no way of really knowing except by using the models, or maybe finding another Microraptor. They're small though. It's tough. They're bizarre. It's also bizarre, but they are clearly aerial.
Carl, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Do any of the other fossil skeletons of Archaeopteryx show any kind of remnant feathers on the hind legs?
No, not as far as we know, no. And none of them do. But this one, a lot of them show some feathering, but not a lot. This is the best. The Berlin specimen is the best one. Interestingly, London had the first crack at it, but they didn't want to spend any money for some reason. I don't know. They blew it. But the London has a specimen that I think has feathers and everywhere, except doesn't have a very good skull. So yeah, no other fossil Archaeopteryx, no Archaeopteryx fossils that we have now in their present condition show long feathered legs. Let me be clear.
Right, but
an argument that the Berlin specimen got mutilated.
Right, and the others aren't as well preserved, therefore you can't tell. Okay.
Yes, you can't tell. Yeah.
Okay.
And you're
We'll
right.
just have to find another one.
The fact that the others don't show it at all is an argument, and an argument against hypothesis that Archaeopteryx had four wings. So
okay, thank you.
If it did have four wings, yeah, this is sort of a what if sort of thing. It's another rabbit hole that people could get stuck in.
Cal, I can totally buy into the idea that number one, the bird has to fly. So if it doesn't fly, it's not a bird.
Right.
So in terms of defining who is the oldest bird, I think independent flight is essential. And I also, understand that the asymmetric wings are essential for that flight. But aren't there other things? Aren't there other aerodynamic properties that the animal would have to exhibit in order to support flight? And does Archaeopteryx check all those boxes as well? Or are we not looking at it?
Just about. I will say Archaeopteryx does not have a very big sternum, but that's about it. It does have a sternum. Let me show you that. That's an interesting. It has a nice furculum, nice wishbone. Where is that picture? Yeah, that's the sternum. But of course, that's a pigeon. Pigeons go 40 miles an hour. This guy was just learning how to, he's just starting out. And there's no indication of how big the muscles are, but look at that furculum. That's a fairly substantial furculum. So there were some substantial flight muscles, let's call them that.
Okay.
They probably just weren't like breast meat. weren't like chicken breasts or pigeon breasts. But the fact that teeth were small, I mean, this is definitely a transitional fossil. It's interestingly, the next oldest fossil is of the bird. The next oldest fossil bird is Confucius Ornis. It's a very common fossil. You could probably go to a fossil store and buy it for, it won't be cheap, but they're definitely on the market. And this thing had lost all its teeth. It had, I think it still has a reduced tail. So we were right at this transition between aerodynamic, better flight. But I mean, your point's well taken.
Yeah, just curious, really.
It's on the road to flight, and definitely aerial. The fact that Microraptor, I don't know how Microraptor probably glided, and I'm sure this animal probably glided, but the furculum and the fact that every feather is asymmetric. The tail is a rudder, the wings are a flight surface. It's a powerful argument that it was flying already. It was definitely aerial. The asymmetric feathers definitely show it's aerial.
Do we know anything about the? Do we know anything about the muscle tendons and the strength at which they could have?
I don't think they've ever gotten that kind of preservation. That is very, very unusual. The feathers were good enough. I'm trying to think. Muscles just don't fall.
Well, do we know anything about the mechanics of the motion of the animal? Or about?
Well, like the levers, they're definitely, well, see right there, that is a major point of muscle attachment. As is the furculum is supporting, and I mean, it's not a pigeon. And where's the raptor? There we go. This guy wasn't flying. This guy was running. This guy, and the sternum looks bigger. It is bigger. It is more significant here. There's a lot of muscle in flight, and muscle doesn't fossilize very well at all. I think the only muscle I know about that's fossilized for any use is the fossilized heart in that dinosaur in Raleigh. That people have been showing the fact that dinosaurs may have had 4-chambered hearts, but that's not the same as a flight muscle. Yeah.
That heart has been proven not to be a heart.
Really?
I'm a volunteer at the museum, so yeah, they've now said it is not. It's a concretion.
Oh, what a shame.
Yeah, very disappointing, but.
Well, it's interesting you brought them, I brought the museum up, but maybe I asked this, do you still have the pterosaurs in the big room, open room? And do they still have fuzz? Do they still have a dinosaur fuzz on them?
Those are still the same, yeah.
Good, because people are arguing that pterosaurs have feathers. The dinosaur people are not happy about that. But not only do pterosaurs have some sort of pelt, but the feathers have appeared also in the bird hip dinosaurs. So feathers originated before the theropods. So dinosaurs may not even, they may have invented birds, but they may not have invented feathers. But that's a big stinky article.
Dr. Bond, I have another follow-up question on the Archaeopteryx.
Yeah.
On the dozen or so examples you mentioned, do any of those to your knowledge, show any pigmentation at all?
No. Well, I'm not sure they've looked, and if they have, I have not heard about it. The pigmentation is, that's an interesting point. Richard Crumb probably should have mentioned it in his in the textbook that this is taken from. That I don't think so. Pigmentation needs, it needs a very special kind of preservation, or even more special than what the Berlin specimen has. But you
and
know,
maybe even
well, also to analyze the pigment, you have to destroy pieces of the specimen, and I don't think they want to do that.
Probably has to have special, not only preservation, but as far as the way the fossil is prepared, or probably the pigmentation would be destroyed.
And to test, I think they literally, see, there are lots of Microraptors, and I'm not sure, well, where is Anchiornis? Yeah, there's pigment there. The Chinese, you know, I'm not sure how many specimens they have found of this, but Archaeopteryx, you just don't want to have a chunk taken out right here, and people notice. And the pigmentation's not that apparent, unlike here. So,
right.
I think visibility with the specimen, and also I think you have to destroy pieces of it, or take pieces out and look. I mean, this is a cellular component. These are melanosomes, and they can look at the shape and say, oh, it's red, or it's black, or they can see lack of melanosomes, says, oh, that's a white spot. And they may be able to see the white pigment, what are those things called? Shoot, I can't remember. Anyway, there's some, like fish has them. I'm not sure birds have them. They have white pigment, as it were. But you got to look at the cell structure, or the cellular structure of these things, and that can be pretty invasive. So it's an interesting question. The first feather, the oldest, well, let's see, is that the oldest feather? Not anymore. The first feather fossil was found before Archaeopteryx in the same bed. And it is quite dark, but I can't visualize it if it's dark enough. And I don't think they're gonna hack a piece of it. I'll have to look at the cell structure. I mean, this sort of stuff, the less invasive, the better. That's why all these tomography using radiation imaging is so important to a lot of these things. And I guess that's what happened with the heart, the dinosaur heart. When did they find out that it was just a concretion? That's so sad.
Not that long ago, but there was a lot of study done on it, and there just isn't the structure there to support.
Is it a gizzard stone instead?
Nobody's mentioned that as a possibility.
Interesting. Or could even a crop stone. You know, they have, dinosaurs are like crocodiles, and actually they're more like birds because they have crop and gizzard stones. And that just always blows me away that some of these animals still, you can see the stones where they are. But I'm sure that occurred to the workers there. And this was that's a duck-billed dinosaur, right? I forgot.
It's a Thessalosaurus.
Oh, I think, it's a predator? I can't remember either. Anyway, interesting. Just to make things interesting, this is something that was taken off. This is the other viewpoint that is not the majority opinion, in that birds have an independent lineage from the dinosaurs. This is a very strange fossil. Only one is known. Several associated scales, or whatever these things are, have been found. Look how old it is. It is not a dinosaur. It is one of those basal archosaurs. It was discovered in Kyrgyzstan, which is probably part of the problem. And some people argue that these are proto-feathers. This makes the dinosaur bird people very upset. And this was in the textbook, the last edition, and was taken out 2 years ago. But we don't, there's an awful lot out in the fossil record that we still don't understand completely. And some people think this is a fake, or that these are plant parts. But I've seen the article showing a shaft and a vein, but it's not your typical feather. But this is where the feathers may have come from. But like I said, this is very much a minority in opinion. As I said, this has been taken out of the textbooks. So this is much safer. And it's still a big argument about whether Archaeopteryx was on the ground or in the trees. That I don't get, but people like the cursorial hypothesis because theropods were ground runners. So Archaeopteryx was running on the ground too. It's like, the thing is that this thing was definitely not running on the ground.
Do we not know what environment, Carl, do we not know what environment Archaeopteryx lived in?
It was swamp.
Have they not figured that out?
Oh yeah, it's swamp with trees.
And they weren't running on the ground. They were in a swamp.
Yeah, that's true. Well, you could argue that. Or you could say, well, they're running up on stumps, which is a possibility.
Well, that could also indicate something about how their flight was being used. If it was a really forested area, sort of like Microraptor, etc., they're not flying long distances. They're just flying short hops in between here to there. Therefore, they don't need giant flight muscles.
I'm thinking, yes, that's quite so. I'm thinking it was a wet tropical forest. I'm not sure how much open space was available, but I think it was these forests, lots of gymnosperms and fern allies.
Yeah, it's not like they're migrating from Alaska to Mexico and back. They're just hopping from tree to tree.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And there's some interesting arguments that these things could also be used for insect capture initially. But what were the legs for? The legs were there for display. I think that's a good argument initially.
Yeah, so I can see that Archaeopteryx probably flew short spans, but not large spans.
Oh,
but then maybe as the environment dried out, then they adapted and got more and more flight worthy as they had to fly farther and farther distance.
The Jurassic to the Cretaceous was getting more and more jungle-like. Well, let me think about that. I can't remember how the climate was changing. There were still a lot of trees, and this is definitely not a prairie. It was definitely a forest for both of these animals.
Right.
Definitely forest animals.
Just thinking that may have spurred some of the transition between the Archaeopteryx to modern birds, is that if the climate changed, then they would have to adapt and could end up having to fly far.
Of course, at the same time, we still have pterosaurs doing everything pterosaurs do, and they were very aerial. And some of them were huge, fighter jets, 33-foot wingspans. And I just read somewhere that some of the biggest pterosaurs may have not used cliffs to fly, but literally were able to jump into the air.
Wow.
but I know that we'll see. I think a cliff would have been easier.
Are you able to hear me? This is Trish.
Yes, Trish, we can hear you.
Great. I have two questions. Why were the theropods called bird hips when the birds actually evolved from the theropods? That's always confused me.
Why weren't the theropods called I didn't get that word.
All right. The theropods, I think, were called the bird hip dinosaurs.
Oh, no, they're not. They're not. The whole thing about the hip, okay, let's go back to that. It's, the thing is, basically, the simple question is, the simple answer is, the original bird hips were the duck-billed dinosaurs and the horned dinosaurs, and they had hips that looked like birds to the paleontologists back in the 1880s that were describing them. The sauropods and the theropods that they knew about had hips that were more reptilian. And that's why these are called saurischians. And yes, they're birds, but they evolved from the saurischian lineages. And it's just an unfortunate confusion. It's unavoidable because there's no way you're going to get rid of this word saurischia unless somebody thought something different 100 years ago. The law of primacy, I can never remember. Taxonomy follows lots of strange laws. But I will say, this should make you feel a little better. Not this one. This one. Here's the lizard hip, lizard hip, lizard hip. And as you get closer to the bird lineages, the pubis moves back, looking like a bird. So they came from a lizard hip lineage, lizard hip ancestors. But then the hips became more and more bird-like. Does that make you feel better?
Yes, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
The other question I had was, with chickens, are their feathers symmetrical since they really don't fly, or some of them have asymmetrical feathers?
It depends. The wild type is very asymmetrical. They all fly. They don't like to fly. That's why they have white meat. Breast meat in chickens is white because the flight muscles are there for emergencies. The dark meats in the legs, which is what they use mostly for locomotion. Wild turkeys hate to fly. They much rather run. And that's why wild turkey legs are kind of tough. But wild chickens, and I would say the normal barnyard chicken is going to have asymmetric feathers unless they've been bred to have silky feathers. There's a couple of breeds called silkies, and they're very fluffy, and they, I believe, are asymmetric. And it gets even weirder. Their feathers if they get wet, they have to be dried off. And they are very prone to hypothermia because even though it looks fluffy, it doesn't insulate well because the barbs of the filaments, the feathers aren't interlocking anymore at all. So it's like putting a down pillow in the water and expecting it to be warm. It's not.
Thanks a whole lot. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Chickens, wild type, and most normal chickens, barnyard chickens will have asymmetric feathers because they can fly if they have to, but they'd rather not.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you. That's a good question.
Yeah, those were some great questions, everyone. is there, and this has been a really great exchange of information. It's been fascinating to see. Are there any other questions from the membership?
I'm sorry to hear about the dinosaur heart or whatever it is now, but thanks for updating me on that.
Yeah, see, Cal, you can come here and get all the latest information. Who'd have thought?
I need to come to the museum again. It's been a while.
All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I will just let everybody know that in the chat, Mike has put up a link to an article about the dinosaur